Fakers and frauds can be very clever and industrious, as well as the opposite. Bruce Charlton. I recently attended a lecture on frauds in the world of fine art, especially painting, the more notorious examples of those who pass off their own work as that of famous, prestigious, expensive painters from the past. My take-home message was that the world of fine arts is rife with fakes. The experts are easily fooled, and indeed an integral part of the scam, and some of the fakers are not just skilled but very clever in marketing their forgery by indirect and non-obvious means. I also read more about a notorious and very successful Welsh literary faker called Eola Morgan, Edward Williams, who was so skilled, industrious and clever that his frauds have become inextricably bound up with Welsh literary history, and the history of revived neo-Druidry. My own reading has led me to consider an influential 20th century mystic called Wellesley Tudor Pole, and the eventual conclusion that he was essentially, but, of course, not wholly, successful examples never are, a fraud and liar, also clever, capable, industrious, and charismatic. It is not exactly big news that the world of esotericism and mysticism has many fakers and frauds, but perhaps it is more surprising that some of the most fated instances of art are, at least I believe, fakes. These are fields in which the basic setup makes it easier to be fraudulent. But nowadays the same applies everywhere of which I have insider knowledge, such as science, and especially medical research, as became blazingly obvious in 2020. One difficulty in acknowledging this is that people underestimate the industriousness and strategic thinking of frauds. Another is that they underestimate the degree to which truth can be distorted or inverted by seeding broadly correct information with a few key falsehoods. Another is to underestimate the importance of theory as compared with facts. But a further difficulty relates to motivation. What motivates the faker or fraud? Normal people are not only too lazy to be seriously fraudulent, but they lack sufficiently strong motivation. Some frauds seem clearly to be after money, or sex, or status, which are pretty normal motivations. However, not all fakers and frauds are impelled by normal motivations, or else their normal motives are so extreme as to become abnormal. Normal people are too normal for them to realize the strangeness of motivations in the kind of people who do become successful frauds. I include myself here. The motivations of some people can be so strange as to be utterly obscure, and this fact strongly protects frauds and fakes from detection. This can be such a strong block on understanding, that even solid and certain examples of fraud tend to be neglected, ignored, or forgotten, because they just don't make sense to people, and can't be integrated into their ideologies and schemes of understanding. All of this is extremely important in terms of someone seeking the meaning of life, and addressing ultimate questions. Because it is quite likely that the experts and wise men that we encounter in our searchings will, no matter in what domain we are searching, include some, perhaps many, frauds and fakes. And yet the evidence suggests that these frauds and fakes are not detectable by any feasibly attainable level of expertise and specialized knowledge, and with the time and energy we have available. So what can we do, in practice? In my experience, the best guide, and maybe the only guide, is when we have a genuine intuitive conviction that some kind of fakery and fraud is afoot. When the alarm bells go off, often subconsciously, at first, or subtly, at the time we encounter a person or work, a sense that somebody is up to something, and not what they seem, or, more exactly, not what they are trying to make us believe. Yet a great deal of modern culture is, for obvious reasons, dedicated to inducing us to ignore, systematically, such intuitive promptings, and to induce other, alternative, external, cultural, fake intuitions, especially that somebody or something that is actually good, true, beautiful, virtuous, is instead untrustworthy. They want us to reject as frauds and fakes exactly that which we most need and would most benefit us. Therefore, even in terms of what seem to be our own intuitions of validity, we need to apply our best possible and deepest intuitive awareness, and to become aware of the difference between a real intuition, and something that has been artificially, perhaps subtly and deviously, implanted, including implanted in exactly the strategic and indirect fashion that fakes and frauds pass off their work. Sometimes, I find all that needs to happen, is that we seriously consider that something, some person, some event may be a fraud or a fake, then immediately to realize that of course. Obviously it is. This may sound superficial, but isn't, at least not if your metaphysical assumption is that we really do have a real, eternal and potentially divine, self, that can form a genuine bottom line for our knowledge. Faeries and ETs, appeal to different kinds of person. Bruce Charlton. Many have noticed that there is a generic similarity between reports of sightings and contact with fairies and with extraterrestrials, ETs, and this has been variously explained in Jungian terms, either with or without some objectively real perceptual basis. In other words, at some deep level, whether psychological or physical, fairies and ETs are the same phenomenon, that manifests superficially in very different forms. But the kinds of people who are interested by, and report, fairies versus those interested in ETs, seem quite different in terms of their general stance and motivations. Fairies are a focus for people with a range of New Age and esoteric interests, those who I would characterize as seeking a reversion towards the ancient and early childhood consciousness of original participation. In other words, such people seek an escape from the cut-offness and alienation of modern consciousness, and desire immersively to integrate with a living, animated, world, that includes fairies along with animals, plants and landscape. Thus, fairies seem to serve as an intermediary between man and nature, or man and the earth more generally. By contrast, ETs are of interest to people with an alternative, conspiracy theory, political stance. The idea that alien species from outer space have an interest in the Earth, a presence among men, a desire for contact with men, and they desire to exert an influence of some kind on this world. ET enthusiasts therefore usually place ETs into a worldview that is mundane, and indeed primarily socio-political. ETs are variously regarded as either / both benign and malign in their intentions for the organization and goals of the Earth. Sometimes ETs are interpreted as intending to protect the Earth, e.g. against catastrophic pollution, or against the possibility of nuclear war, and also sometimes other kinds of ET are understood to be among or influencing the global establishment in their sinister plans to enslave and exterminate men and the planet. So, maybe there is some kind of common basis for experience of fairies and ETs, but if so, differences in personality, and ideology/spirituality lead to a different ascribed function, motivation, and human role for these beings. God or what? An approach to the purpose of creation. Francis Berger. I have been mulling over a recent comment Bruce Charlton left on an earlier post in which I argued that freedom revealed the purpose of creation. In his comment, Dr. Charlton refers to two disparate cases concerning the nature of God and creation, the first being the conventional conceptualization of God or nothing and the unconventional view of God or chaos. The first case posits God as the ultimate creator of everything and argues that there would be nothing without God. The second case envisions God as a primary creator who shaped and formed creation from pre-existing material, for lack of a better way of putting it, that was chaotic and purposeless. God or nothing and God or chaos is another angle from which one can view the old creatio ex nihilo versus creatio ex materia debate. The God or nothing approach insists upon the absolute necessity of God for the simple reason that without him, nothing could exist or be. God not only is, he absolutely must be, for without him, there would be nothing but a void of nothingness. In other words, I am must be because there is literally nothing on the other side of that thunderous I am. Every being needs God, but God needs no other beings. No being is utterly necessary but God. This absolute necessity of God relegates everything in existence or being to the state of contingency. Every being in existence is utterly dependent on God in every way imaginable, even when they exercise their God-given freedom to reject God altogether. However, the God-given free rejection of the divine Creator does not negate God's thunderous I am declaration. The creatures He created from nothing can never return to the nothing from whence they came. They either come to know and worship Him or suffer the consequences of their free rejection, the capacity for which God created from nothing. The God or chaos case envisages God as the primary creator. Without God, there is no creation, only chaos. God can still say I am, but His necessity takes on an entirely different hue. The creatures He shaped existed in some form before entering creation, so He is not necessary for their core pre-existence as beings but crucial to their existence in creation. They come to know Him and attempt to understand why they are creation, or they may reject Him and, perhaps, choose to return to the chaos from which they emerged. Since God did not create the freedom driving such a choice, it remains authentically free. Note added, I'm not sure if returning to pre-existent chaos is possible, but I imagine that God may grant such an option to beings that do not wish to be in creation. The nature of primal chaos, God or chaos versus God or nothing, continuing a dialogue with Francis Berger. Bruce Charlton. The background goes back some way, but could be regarded as a post by Francis Berger discussing the nature of freedom, and comments from Krista Lawson of the Orthosphere. The theme then became the nature of God, as God ought to be understood by Christians, in particular whether, on the one hand, God created absolutely everything from absolutely nothing, ex nihilo. Or on the other hand, whether God created from something pre-existent, in particular beings, living, purposive, conscious to some degree, self-sustaining etc., that had always existed, co-eternally with God. Krista comments.
Because He is subaltimate, the Mormon God is unnecessary, contingent, and dependent, like Zeus or Thor.
This is interestingly wrong, in part, because it reveals several of the assumptions into which philosophy came to embed mainstream Christian theology. Perhaps the key term is contingent, in that the desire of classical theology is to describe a state of affairs that could not be otherwise than it is. If that was true then, by my understanding, there can be no real freedom. Freedom has been excluded by assumption. Unnecessary is related to the desire to escape all contingency, to insist that things cannot be other than what they are. However, this also entails that nothing can really change. But when there is life/consciousness/being, there is change, and change is directional and sequential, and this is something that everybody is born already knowing. The Mormon concept of God, and Emo the real God, is indeed necessary in the sense that God is the creator, and without God there would be no creation. So it is a case of God or chaos. But the philosophy, expressed by Krista, that, IMO, captured Christian theology, wants it to be that there must be God, now and always, and nothing would be without God. This is a case of God or nothing. Well, that idea of necessity is a very particular view of God. Most gods/gods throughout history and the world, including some descriptions of the God of the Old Testament, it seems clear enough, do not conform to this idea of necessity. Indeed, extremely few people, now or ever, could even conceive of a God in that sense, and could not express it if they did. They would not want or see reason to posit such an entity. What is strange to me is that so many Christian theologians, from very early in the Christian Church, seem to have decided to make the assumption that only such an abstract entity is a real God, or deserves to be considered a God. It is strange because of Jesus Christ. If Christianity had been a pure monotheism, this dogmatic assumption would be comprehensible, but given the incarnate nature of Jesus, the man, Son of God, who was born, grew, lived in time, who died, etc., etc. Well, it is just plain strange for Christians to make an insoluble problem from Jesus, just because of their pre-existing philosophical convictions. And having made the nature of Jesus such a big problem, but not so strange to pretend that all questions have been answered, but at a level of abstraction so remote that all contradictions dissolve into each other. Francis Berger then wrote a post amplifying on some of the above concepts. Deriving the nature of God from a God or chaos distinction seems to be a useful shorthand of the paired alternatives that arise from the metaphysical assumptions that I share with Francis Berger. His comment stimulated a few further clarifications. God or chaos could be reframed as love or chaos, since creation derives from love. Furthermore, it is vitally important that God creates from beings and not from materia. By my understanding, God did not start with inert, unalive stuff but already alive and conscious, purposive beings. That pre-creation reality was of beings is essential to the reality and nature of freedom. If pre-creation reality was not already alive and already conscious, by their nature and from eternity, then the problem of where freedom comes from remains unanswered. Because, ultimately, freedom just isn't something that can be made or gifted. And the same applies to life, or consciousness, or purpose. These are attributes of beings, and cannot be bestowed upon no beings, things or material. Therefore, chaos should not be pictured scientistically as some kind of Brownian motion of dead molecules. Instead, chaos should be understood as a situation in which beings are self-centered in their purposes and methods, autonomous in their worldview. So, this debate is not a rerun of creatio ex nihilo versus creatio ex materia, because the starting point is an already alive, animated, universe, but one in which living beings are uncoordinated, each pulling in a different direction, all with different motivations. Creation is therefore understood as the incremental and progressive harmonization and direction of a multitude of already existing living beings by love, that is, by love of God, which provides ultimate coherence, and of each other, without which creation would break down. In other words, the two great commandments, first to love God, then to love our neighbor, fellow men, and by extension all other beings. Chaos is a collection of unharmonious beings, each doing his own thing, wholly self-motivated, unloving and indifferent to other beings, and perhaps unaware of them. It is this kind of situation, upon which God initiates the process of creation. But, this was only the beginning of creation, because it led to a mixed world of continuing chaos and, within this, an expanding divine creation. Creation exists insofar as love motivates, but love is, at best, incomplete in any being. So far this is monotheism, not Christianity. The completion and perfection of creation, into a wholly good world, i.e. heaven, required the later intervention of Jesus Christ. This is therefore the second creation. Is poor concentration and clouded consciousness a spiritual problem? Bruce Charlton. As a young adult and into middle age, I seem to have an unusually strong ability to focus on a particular theme, and stick with it, in the context of feeling very clear in my thinking and holding to the willed topic. That ability has diminished significantly as I moved into old age, later 50s. Initially I fought the changes, but gradually realized that there is nothing that can be done about this. Thinking depends on the body and its health and functionality, so its quality is not something that can be changed by willpower being, of course, subject to exactly the same changes. Given my overall understanding of the nature and purpose of our mortal lives, I assume that these problems, and they are problems pathologies, because they are dysfunctionalities, ought to become the focus of learning. not as things to be overcome, because we are mortals in an entropic world and will functionally decline and die, but as stimuli towards a change of purpose. In the first place, my thinking abilities when I was healthier and more functional did not lead to spiritual benefits. Indeed, by the early 2000s, I had thought myself into a pretty appalling spiritual impasse of the usual, mainstream type: materialism, positivism, reductionism, relativism, scientism. Proving, yet again, that ability and power is a curse when misapplied. My sense of things is that when one cannot think with the same clarity and purpose, this signals the need to move towards less strategic, more here and now purposes, in particular awareness, discernment, and repentance. In other words, rather than trying to direct and control thinking in predecided directions, I ought to be more aware of what is currently happening in my thinking, aware that thinking is indeed, at some point, currently clouded, or perhaps blunted. That I am not currently conscious of and engaged with the environment, physical and social, and the world of spirit in the ways I want, the ways I regard as optimal, i.e. discernment is needed. That I repent this state of mind, and regard the situation as suboptimal at best, and often evil in terms of being wrongly motivated, for example seeking comfort, pleasure, rest, relief from suffering, rather than being creatively orientated to reality with love and in freedom. I assume that what I can do is also what I most need to do, here and now, at this point in the proceedings, i.e. to clarify myself and my intentions and attainment in an honest and accurate way. And to be clear also about what, behind the unavoidable but superficial constraints of the mortal body and entropic/evil world, I most want. Even though I cannot usually make myself want it, in the present time and circumstances. The impulse and motive for divine creation. Bruce Charlton. Krista at the Authorsphere has written a post in response to mine of yesterday and others by Francis Berger, that asks several questions. These seem to require and deserve a more extensive elucidation than can be done in comments, including an expansion of underlying metaphysical assumptions, so here it is. This procedure distorts my metaphysical views, because they are being expressed in response to Krista's framework of ultimate assumptions, so that, even when I try to elucidate, means that my account is fragmentary and seen from an alien angle. But maybe this is the best that can be managed in the circumstances. Obviously, I usually and by preference express my metaphysical ideas in their own terms, trying to make a model or paint a picture of how reality is structured and proceeds.
The situation prior to creation that Bruce describes is already a world, a disharmonious congeries of eternal conscious selves, purposive beings who suffer effects, who feel, want, act, and so on.
That is a correct description of my views.
Who relate to and influence each other, so that they can love, or not, all more or less ordered to a good, which apparently they can all more or less recognize, and to which they are more or less attracted.
No. Before creation there is no such interaction or harmonization.
They are from eternity past together in a temporal, and so, presumably also spatial, milieu, in which they have and prosecute lives, but only messily.
Sort of. But before creation there is no comparison by which their autonomous lives can be called messy.
Thus they can apprehend each other, and God, and His creative plan, they can find it attractive, can want to participate in it, and can then actually do so.
No. I regard the above description as happening after creation has been initiated.
The question then arises, what is the reason of this world that was running along from eternity past, all on its own, before one of its constituents got started on his creative project, or after, for that matter? If we answer that there is no prior reason it is what it is, that its eternal existence is a brute fact, we have admitted that it is fundamentally unintelligible, for, what has no sufficient reason to be what it is cannot be reasonable, either in whole or in part, for, brute facts are utterly inscrutable, in principle, thus even to themselves.
Correct. Before creation there can be no reasons, except internally, privately, within beings. Things just are.
What is not reasonable cannot be a world, or for that matter any such thing as the items we find all around us, and in us. It can be rather only just stuff happening for no reason, the chaos of democracy and atomism, but with the atoms all sentient, solipsistically.
Yes, pretty much a correct summary, except that having sentient beings/atoms makes all the difference. Divine creation is, pretty much, the transformation from solipsistic to ongoing creation, insofar as creation has happened, which changes through time, because creation is linear and sequential.
If we say that this world prior to creation has no cause because it is necessarily what it is, then every detail of it must be necessary, in which case there is in it no freedom, for it is a spatio-temporally extended block, in which nothing really moves or acts, or therefore is.
No, this is wrong. Necessity does not come into it when things just are. Things really move, but only within beings, not between beings.
What we end up with then is either the pure chaos of brute unintelligible fact, and no world, or else the wholly determined motionlessness of universal necessity.
No, neither of these alternatives, because they are regarding the primordial beings as if unalive. Starting with beings rather than things makes all the difference.
There is of course a third option, the classical metaphysics of Nicene Christianity, in which God is uniquely eternal and necessary is the sufficient reason for all being, including his own, not a brute fact, but on the contrary the perfectly intelligent and thus intelligible fact, in whose light all other things are intelligible, at least in principle, so that knowledge is possible, and in which creatures are not eternal, but rather contingent upon God, so that as contingent they can change, act, suffer, move, love, learn, grow, understand and be understood, and so forth.
This leads on to consider God's motivation for creation. If God is a unity, there can be no motive for anything. Such a God just is. But my understanding is that God is a dyad of heavenly parents, Heavenly Father and Mother. My understanding is that it is the love between our heavenly parents that is the motivation for creation, in a way closely analogous to the spiritually understood way that love between two ideal, loving human beings may lead to the choice of initiating procreation, that is having children who are loved, and beginning what may be an extended family. Of course, mortal human parents are born as already part of an extended and, ideally, loving family. But I am here talking about how this all began. Creation is therefore a concept that arises from love, and includes procreation as well as all the other many ways in which loving relationships between beings of all kinds may become. To put matters very simply, there is a timeline for creation. The primordial situation of autonomous and not relating beings becomes creation as a consequence of our heavenly parents meeting, becoming mutually aware, and committing themselves to eternal love. Our heavenly parents thus became God, and creation began by God's interventions on primordial reality, and to the extent that primordial beings opt in to live by love. This was not the original situation of reality, there was a time when it happened, and it might not have happened. Furthermore, beings are usually only partly capable of love, and presumably some beings are incapable of love, and therefore do not participate in creation. Thus God's primary creation is a mixed state of love, and not love. And it is this deficit in primary creation that led to the need for Jesus Christ and the second creation, needed because Jesus completes the work of creation by enabling heaven, which is the eternal situation of beings living by love, leaving behind other and evil motivations at resurrection. By contrast, Orthodox traditional Nicene Christianity perhaps needs to posit a motive for creation, a motive for God creating rather than not, and therefore, sometimes posits an analogous impetus for creation in the love of the Father, Son and Holy Ghost, each for the other. It is the differences between the Trinity that enable the love that leads to creation. However, this explanation is made confusing/incoherent by also insisting that the Trinity are not only different from each other, but also simultaneously the same as each other, because there is only one God. This is required by the insistence on a monotheistic omni-God creating ex nihilo. Such a God cannot be internally subdivided. And furthermore, orthotrad theology has it that the process of creation, and of love among the Trinity, happens outside of time, so creation always was and is, so there is no timeline of creation. All that is now, ever was and shall be. And this is the point at which Orthodox Christianity reaches its particular it just is assumption. Explanations stop at this point. All metaphysics must reach this point, sooner or later, the point at which we must make assumptions regarding the ultimate nature of reality. The goal, as I see it, is to become aware of where this point is reached, to acknowledge this, and to know that here we are indeed making assumptions. Which activity is, I suggest, properly called metaphysics. Creation. Why mess up something perfect? Francis Berger. Fellow blogger Krista of the Authorsphere has written a post in response to some posts and comments Bruce Charlton and I have shared over the past few weeks concerning the nature of God and freedom and the motive/purpose of creation. Dr. Charlton has written a response to that post here. The discussions continue, but breakthroughs remain elusive. Krista's approach to such metaphysical assumptions is firmly anchored in the traditional, classical, conventional assumptions of Nicene Christianity because he finds them intelligible, as opposed to the apparently unintelligible assumptions Bruce or I posit.
There is of course a third option, the classical metaphysics of Nicene Christianity, in which God is uniquely eternal and necessary is the sufficient reason for all being, including his own. Not a brute fact, but on the contrary the perfectly intelligent and thus intelligible fact, in whose light all other things are intelligible, at least in principle, so that knowledge is possible, and in which creatures are not eternal, but rather contingent upon God, so that as contingent they can change, act, suffer, move, love, learn, grow, understand and be understood, and so forth.
The chief problem with the intelligible fact of a uniquely eternal and necessary God who is the sufficient reason for all being, including his own, is it focuses almost entirely on the how of creation while simultaneously and conveniently sidestepping the why of creation. Krista's position is simple. Creation had to have a cause, more specifically, a first cause. This first cause is God, the creator and source of all being, including his own. Without God, there would be no creation, yet creation remains completely unnecessary to God, who has no needs or wants whatsoever and is entirely self-sufficient. Let's take a moment and consider God's position before creation, not an easy thing to do within the classical/traditional framework, which places God outside of time, but anyway. Okay, here we go. The only being who exists before creation is God. Put another way, nothing exists but God. Time does not exist. Nothing happens, nothing changes. Yet, all is perfect because God is perfect. Think about that for a moment. Before creation, God, in his solitude or his Trinity communion, existed in perfection. Existence was perfect because only a single ideal being existed, and nothing else. This single perfect being needs nothing, wants nothing, and experiences nothing but the eternal perfection of his ideal state of self-willed being. From that state of absolute perfection, God inexplicably, and dare I say, unintelligibly decides to create. Unintelligible because the very act of deciding to embark upon a creation that would be less than perfect, that its creator, due to his omni-attributes, knew full well would be imperfect, strikes me as the most unintelligible of all unintelligible facts. Why would a perfect being willfully decide to create imperfection in his perfection? Well, decide is the wrong word. He has no choice but to create imperfection because he cannot duplicate his perfection because it is a squared circle. Still, why mess with a perfect state of being? God's state of being before creation implies that he could not have made that state of being any better. Creation has not improved it in any way, shape, or form. That is what perfection means. Thus, the impulse for creation cannot be grounded in the motivation to make things better, because such a thing would have been impossible for God to do. I won't go so far as to say God was motivated to make things worse, but perhaps he wanted a change. Yet Nicene Christianity posits God as immutable. Perhaps he needed something other than himself or his Trinity. Okay, but Nicene Christianity claims God is impassible and has no needs. So, God creates, and it isn't just God alone anymore. There is time, space, matter, and creatures of all sorts, including man, all created from nothing, and all created for good. However, God decides to create creatures that are capable of evil because free will. However, being omniscient and omnipotent, God knows full well that evil, suffering, and atrocities of all sorts will occur. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm still searching for the why of creation in all of this, starting with the unintelligible fact of why a perfect being who needs nothing would bother creating non-eternal imperfection out of nothing and call it good, non-eternal imperfection that he does not want or need, but that is then utterly contingent upon him for its very existence. Christa cites knowledge as the overarching motive or impulse behind creation. That is, an absolute, perfect, unchangeable God decides on creation so that we, his imperfect, non-eternal, created from nothing creatures, can change, act, suffer, move, love, learn, grow, understand, and be understood. Why a perfect being, perfect in his solitude, would decide upon such a thing remains something of a mystery. Having said all of that, I agree with Christa to some degree. The purpose of creation is rooted in learning, growing, understanding, and loving, but such a purpose must emanate from something intelligible. An absolute, immutable, impassible, unchangeable, self-sufficient God who existed alone in total perfection before creation is not and cannot be the source of that intelligibility. God needs no motive for creation, a total non-answer. Francis Berger. In his latest addition to the ongoing discussion, now focused mostly on the matter of creation, Christa writes.
In his latest contribution to this discussion, Francis Berger asks why a perfect God would go to the trouble of creating anything less than perfect, less than himself, other than himself. Not having read that contribution before I wrote the paragraph just above, I believe that in it I had answered this question.
Okay, so let's see how Christa answers why a perfect God would go through the trouble of creating anything less than perfect, less than himself, other than himself. Put another way, what is God's motive for creation?
Bruce goes on to suggest that Nicene Christianity perhaps needs to posit a motive for creation, a motive for God creating rather than not. Well, no.
Well, no. I guess the first rule of God's motive for creation is you don't talk about God's motive for creation. Okay, but why?
To suppose that God is motivated to do this or that is to mistake him for the sort of being who can lack this or that, as we do, who wants, for example, to move from a state prior to the fulfillment of his will to another state posterior to that fulfillment, as we can do. It doesn't work that way for an eternal intelligence. Sub specie aeternitatis, God's will is always already fulfilled. He lacks nothing, he possesses everything. So, he is not motivated to do anything. He has always already done, is always already doing, all that he would do.
God is an entirely different category of being. He was fulfilled before creation and remains fulfilled after creation. Creation did not alter his fulfillment one iota. If that is indeed the case, then my question remains: if God was so fulfilled before creation, why did he bother with creation at all? The answer Christa provides is basically a non-answer. Our puny hearts and minds can never begin to apprehend the eternal intelligence that is God. Evidence of this lies in the mere fact of supposing God is motivated to do anything at all. I mean, who are we to suppose anything of God or creation? Besides, there is not much point to it because God is not motivated to do anything, at least not as far as our puny hearts and minds can conceive. He's an eternal intelligence, man. You can't even begin to understand God's motives because to do so is to presume God even has motives we could comprehend. He was, is, and always will be and has always done and is already doing all that he would do. For goodness sake, isn't that enough? In the end, because appears to be the only answer Krista can supply to the question of why God created anything at all. Forgive me, but this is kindergarten-level argumentation. To his credit, Krista does go on to provide some explanation of why God created.
God creates because he is perfect, and the nature of perfection is such that it intends and does all the good that can be done.
If God is perfect and was perfect before creation, then his intention to do all the good that can be done by creating everything out of nothing makes no sense because such an intention adds nothing good to the perfection that existed before creation. Nor does it make anything better. God could have enjoyed his perfection without engaging in creation. Why didn't he? Why did God engage in a project to do all the good that can be done knowing full well that such an intention or action makes absolutely no difference at all to his perfection?
His creation is but the outward aspect and effect. In the East, they call these his energies, of his act of simply being himself perfect.
So, creation is merely a side effect of the act of perfection. Is that it? Creating non-perfection is somehow a byproduct of God being his perfect self.
And because he is perfect, necessary, and eternal, and therefore prior to all times, all ages and worlds, the source, forecondition, alpha and omega thereof, thus timeless, there is no point in the eternal duration of his life at which his will is not already eternally fulfilled, and all creaturely things have not already reached their intended fulfillment and perfection.
Motive for creation. God is perfect, necessary, and eternally fulfilled, you're not. Nuff said. Although I find it a bit presumptuous of Krista to claim he has provided an answer to a post he had not read, I believe he has provided the only sort of answer he can all provide concerning the motive/purpose for creation. Unfortunately, that sort of answer amounts to little more than a non-answer. Christianity needs to discover a motive for creation that extends beyond God and his perfection. Now more than ever. No space for Jesus, in mainstream Christian theology. Bruce Charlton. It is clear that freedom does not matter much to many people, perhaps because spiritual freedom entails ultimate responsibility for our own fate. So the fact that mainstream/orthodox/traditional Christian theology has no place for freedom in its conceptualization of God, is not something that deeply bothers those who aspire to total obedience, or the annihilation of the self. This exclusion of space for freedom is somewhat distinct from an explanation for freedom, although the two can go together. There is no space for freedom when God is assumed to be omniscient, to have created everything from nothing, because everything then is ultimately made, known and controlled by God. To explain what freedom is requires a rather different understanding. We need to get an intuitive grasp of what we are talking about when we reference freedom, free will or agency, and develop a picture of how it could happen, even if it seldom does actually happen. The difficulty is that most people have an unconscious assumption that understands every possible action, including every thought, to be caused by some prior stimulus. Such assumptions leave no space for freedom. So freedom must be uncaused. But many modern people vaguely but firmly believe in a thing they call randomness, so then they assume that stuff happens completely unpredictability. But randomness is not freedom. Indeed, it is not an explanation at all but the opposite of explanation. Randomness, if it existed, rather than being just a mathematical tool, would be a denial of even the possibility of explanation. Freedom must therefore be the attribute of a particular person and his nature and motivations. In other words, freedom must be an uncaused cause, a first cause, which is a partial definition of God. Hence, freedom is a first cause, which is a divine attribute. It seems that the conclusion is that men are gods, of the same kind as God, insofar as they are free. Insofar as Jesus Christ really matters to Christians, it is noteworthy that so many Christians have been so concerned to assert the absolute power and fundamental nature of God's unity, omniqualities and total creation, that they have left no space for Jesus the mortal man. And no possibility of explaining why Jesus was necessary. After all, if God is defined as having everything possible already covered, there is nothing substantive for Jesus to do. If God does everything, either directly or via creation, then Jesus is merely optional. The exclusion of freedom by theological assumptions is therefore another side of the same coin that excludes the possibility of a coherent explanation of why Jesus is necessary for the accomplishment of what Jesus offered. If we agree that Jesus, a mortal man, living in a particular place and time, offered the possibility for men to choose resurrected eternal life in heaven, then there must be some reason why Jesus was needed for this task, and if God is predefined in terms of omniqualities, it seems clear that the man Jesus was not necessary for anything. Yet those who accept Jesus' claim to divinity and to be the necessary path to eternal resurrected life should, it seems to me, be making metaphysical assumptions and constructing their theology around that fact. In sum, if Jesus is a man and is necessary, then God cannot be omni. My view is that the reality and necessity of Jesus must be the primary focus and structuring factor in creating a Christian theology of God, not the other way around. Note, it may be asked why, if there is indeed no space for Jesus, so many previous generations of Christians were satisfied by theological explanations. The first answer is that many weren't, and these stayed Jews or embraced Islam. But the main answer is that men's consciousness has changed through history, and world pictures that strike us as abstract and dead used to be spontaneously infused with purpose and meaning, by the innate original participation which men have only recently left behind. Why do I believe that we become aware of our metaphysical assumptions? Bruce Charlton. From a strictly metaphysical perspective, I guess that the important thing is to recognize what we are assuming in an it-justice way, and what is secondarily explained in terms of these assumptions. If this is achieved to some extent, I think we can then compare metaphysical systems or schemes, and then there is a basis for choosing between them. For instance, one person may regard an explanation of freedom/free will/agency as vital to him, but another person may desire that everything he considers important must be as it is, with no contingency, and no possibility of things being otherwise. Such personal imperatives will influence the choice of metaphysical assumptions. Or perhaps, when a person becomes explicitly aware of his own current imperatives, he may come to disapprove of them, and may then reject them. Simply to clarify what one actually is assuming, in a clear and explicit way, is itself something very valuable, maybe essential when it comes to really fundamental matters. Personally, I want my primary assumptions to be the kind of thing that is knowable intuitively, by personal revelation, and without having to depend on communications that may be unreliable, from secondary sources that may not be accurate or trustable. This has meant that, over time, it has been necessary to reduce the dependence of my core faith not only on church teachings, but also on Scripture. I have come to regard both church teachings and Scripture as, for what seem very obvious reasons, unsure and unreliable. I simply cannot stake everything on the accuracy of scriptural transmission and interpretation, or the integrity of any actual modern institution, whether or not it calls itself a church. To generalize, and for a Christian, this means, among other things, knowing both God the Creator, and also, and more importantly, the person of Jesus Christ for oneself, know them here and now as it were, and as the root of everything else. This is edited from a comment at Francis Berger's blog. As an example of what I mean, one metaphysical assumption of this kind that I rejected after having become aware and clear about it, was that God our loving Father would create the world such that the church or churches in general, or access to accurate scriptures, was necessary to salvation. This is a very common assumption, even nowadays, but once I had made it explicit, it seemed clearly wrong. A good and loving God who desired the salvation of men would not organize things thus, because the world and its people are far too varied, over time and geographically, and there is far too much that could, and would, and has, go awry in terms of making salvation depend upon any specific worldly entity, its dissemination, and understanding. It seemed obvious that God would make it possible for all of his children to attain salvation in whatever circumstances they found themselves or contrived, and this would need to be done directly, that is, by sufficient and needful unmediated contact, by what is sometimes termed personal revelation. Since it is Jesus Christ who is essential for each man's salvation, the attaining of salvation would need to be something primarily decided between Jesus, here and now, not depending on historical records, and each man in his specific circumstances. Including, importantly, each man's specific circumstances after biological death, and before the choice of salvation or not. Tethered caps on disposable bottles, a microcosm of strategic, cultural suicide. Bruce Charlton. I began to notice recently that I could not get the caps off bottles of drinks, which remained tethered to the bottle, until I cut them with strong scissors, or tore them free by main force. Otherwise it was nigh impossible to pour the drink because the tethered cap got in the way, and even unscrewing a tethered cap is mechanically self-defeating. After this became more and more common, I belatedly discovered that this was due to a new EU law, and, of course, the UK has never left the EU. This business is a perfect microcosm of here and now. Tethered caps are supposed to encourage recycling of the drink's caps, and recycling is always and invariably a good thing. And the more plastic crap we manufacture, the more we can recycle it, yay? It's all an oh so serious issue, but conveniently serves the stepwise agenda of universal and detailed surveillance and control, by which permissible screw-on bottle top design has been brought under globalist totalitarian control. So, yet again, a dysfunctional and utterly futile law in service of an evil-motivated, anti-life agenda, CO2 climate-excused totalitarianism, has been oh so laboriously discussed and decided upon, and imposed internationally by vast bureaucratic regulatory efforts. One of the stupidest and wrongest of traditional sayings, an inversion of truth, is, look after the pennies and the pounds will take care of themselves. Especially stupid since it arose when there were 240 pennies in a pound sterling. Yet this is modern green environmentalism in a nutshell. In service to fake knowledge about a fake and evil theory concerning climate change, we have governments imposing energy-consuming and CO2-producing laws in pursuit of changes that, even if all predictive climate change models were accurate, which they certainly are not, never having been validated, would have undetectably trivial benefits. Meanwhile engaging in mandatory and colossal environmental destruction, for example by gratuitous and mega-polluting wars. As another instance, thus we have, in the UK, truly draconian criminal laws protecting certain species, such as bats against humans. We are not even allowed to touch these creatures. On the other hand, bats are being slaughtered by the ever-increasing numbers of environmentally friendly, but functionally counterproductive, wind turbines at an admitted rate of thousands to millions per year. Nobody sincere, rational and well-motivated could possibly behave this way, hence we know for sure that those ruling the West are overall dishonest, irrational and evil-motivated. This is possible only by the docile, stupid, and preeningly self-satisfied mindset of the Western managerial intellectual class, a group who personally profit from laboriously and expensively implementing an agenda of pointlessly symbolic pseudo-reform in context of a strategy that is ultimately aimed at purposive political, social, and personal destruction. The ruling demons are laughing themselves sick. Pay attention, and you can hear them. Alone, overnight, in Durham Castle. Bruce Charlton. I once spent the night entirely alone in the ancient structure of Durham Castle, comprising scores of empty hallways, passages and 100+ bedrooms, the kitchens, feasting hall, and both an underground Norman chapel with peculiarly eroded primitive cravings, and a severely dignified 16th century chapel. I was, at the time, a resident don, living in the junction to the Victorian restored and residential keep. It was, I think, the Easter vacation, when undergraduates were absent, and also, for reasons that I cannot now remember, the place was also vacated by postgraduates, the other dons, and even the college porter and her family, who lived in the gatehouse at the back left of the above illustration. The porter told me that I was the only person remaining in residence for the one night, and gave me instructions for locking up and security. On the actual night in question, at first I was unfazed, just getting on with my work. Then it became dark, and mostly very quiet. But there were, in fact, many noises of many kinds, of the kind one would expect in very old buildings, especially creakings and short deep thuds. Quite suddenly I became afraid, and experienced an involuntary picture in my mind of the many dark, empty rooms that surrounded me, and I felt very alone. I considered going out, but did not fancy venturing through the empty halls and courtyard, and liked even less the idea of returning. I did not even want to speak to somebody on the phone, since this would somehow amplify awareness of the oppressive sense of the building around me. In the end, I adopted the cowardly tactic of distraction and hiding. I turned the television and music up loud until I went to bed, inserted earplugs, and took refuge in the oblivion of sleep. By the next morning, everything seemed normal and friendly, and I rather enjoyed the interval until people began to trickle back. But I still recall how thoroughly I spooked myself, or else became aware of aspects of the situation that were normally drowned out of consciousness by the intrusive presence, activities, sounds of many people. End Times Introduction. William Wildeblood. This is part of the introduction to what I am currently calling, following a suggestion by J.M. Smith, Surviving the End Times. Ever since the beginning of Christianity, a large group of believers have thought they were living in the end times and prepared accordingly. Basing this belief on the words of Jesus himself and the book of Revelation, they saw the world around them as lapsing into spiritual decay and human beings as falling away from God into self-concern and atheism. For them this prefigured the return of Christ in glory and the salvation of all those who believed in him. It never happened. Despite Jesus' words that this generation shall not pass, till all these things be fulfilled, the end times never came. But this didn't stop many subsequent generations from believing that they too were living at a time of universal decline. Now we in the 21st century are faced with a similar dilemma. You could think, here we go again? Those believers never learn from their mistakes. How they must love their pessimism, and the sense of self-righteousness it gives them. But something is different today. The signs of spiritual decay are more obvious than ever before, with not just atheism and materialism dominating the minds of most people, but even spirituality, where it exists, being often just a form of therapy aimed at comforting the lower self rather than enabling one to go beyond it. And then Christianity has spread all over the world, as predicted must happen before the end times, but its power has greatly waned, especially in its former heartlands, and Christians themselves are increasingly persecuted, on the one hand, while, on the other, their churches have fallen into a sort of secular humanism, voided of the supernatural element and more concerned with this world than the next. Meanwhile, even many non-religious people, especially since the turn of the millennium, feel that history has run its course and no longer look with optimism towards a brighter future, but see instead one of growing poverty and cultural loss. This book takes for granted that we are indeed living in the end times, though whether these extend for several more years or decades or even longer is a different question. If even Jesus said that only the Father knows when these things will happen, it makes little sense to speculate. Nor is there any real speculation here as to how the end times may conclude or what comes after. Christians expect the advent of the Antichrist followed by the return of Christ himself, and a more universal tradition sees the conclusion of the current Iron Age in large-scale destruction followed by a new Golden Age. Given that spiritual ideas are often expressed symbolically, these could be pointing towards the same thing, which is not to say that Christ is just one more avatar among many, but that pre-Christian and pagan ideas were visions of what became reality with Christ. Entropy exists in the spiritual sense as well as the physical. At the start of a new cycle, spiritual energy is released into the world from above and it forms a new culture which subsequently runs through the normal stages of growth, maturity, decline and death. The initial energy can be renewed at various points in the cycle, rather like saints can revivify religion, but there comes a time when even this possibility has passed. Now, we live at a time when spiritual energy has dissipated to such an extent that the power of matter has asserted itself over everything. The physical and natural environments have actually hardened and coarsened while, on the mental plane, everyone is cut off from the presence of spirit. This affects even believers, which is why saints and miracles are so thin on the ground these days. I do not say that there are no evolved souls around. There may, paradoxically enough, be many, but they too will suffer from the world conditions which are universal. In this book we will examine the end times from a variety of perspectives. We will look at its manifestations, some of which are often regarded as positive by those still enthralled to the psychological consequences of the end times inversion of spirit and matter, and consider its significance from the spiritual perspective. We will look at ways in which the soul may separate itself from the downwards pull of end times energy, and also examine how greater familiarity with the ideas of tradition might rescue modern people brought up and educated, brainwashed one might say, in modern ways, which are ways that derive from the aforementioned inverted ideology of end times energy, in which quantity and matter take precedence over quality and spirit. The subject has endless ramifications and we will only look at a selection of them. But if one bears in mind the basic theme of the end times, that being the dominance of matter over spirit, it becomes easy to recognize it and therefore resist it in almost every walk of life here and now in the 21st century. That way lies freedom, because if you submit to the end times energy, notwithstanding the fact that no one can fully escape it, you are a spiritual slave. These days it is necessary to swim against the current, but, in so doing, we develop our spiritual muscles more than we might do in a more convivial age. You can't have it both ways in metaphysics, unless you are Krista, of course. Francis Berger. In his most recent post in our ongoing discussion, Krista claims that I have misconstrued the eternal God of classical theism and eternity. I responded with the following comment.
You are confusing my apparent misconstrual with disagreement. I haven't misinterpreted the eternal God of classical theism as temporal. I disagree with the assumption that the eternal God of classical theism is atemporal. The same applies to my other supposed misinterpretations of time, freedom, and the motive for creation.
Concerning the post, to which Krista responded, I added, my post demonstrates how the assumptions and assertions of classical theism become incoherent when the framework for said assumptions is removed. For example, an atemporal God becomes incoherent if one assumes the reality of time, which I do. God as the exclusive first cause becomes incoherent if God is not the exclusive first cause, and so forth. Krista, in turn, vehemently protested the approach I had taken.
You can't talk about before and after in the life of the eternal God of classical theism, and argue from the absurdities that result from so doing. without implicitly presupposing that the eternal God of classical theism is temporal. And to do that is to suppose that he is not the God of classical theism to begin with, but rather a god like Thor. If there is before and after in the life of God, so that he could enjoy his perfection before he created, thus raising the question of why he created a world utterly superfluous to his perfect enjoyment, then he is temporal, and he is not the God that the classical theists are talking about, but a straw man and a misdirection and a confusion. You can't have it both ways. If you want to debunk the eternal God of classical theism, you'll have to dispense with all the talk of before and after, and talk about the God of classical theism.
Krista has raised a crucial point when it comes to discussing metaphysics. So, let's take a moment and apply the same point to him. You can't talk about the non-omni qualities of the God of romantic Christianity, for lack of a better way of putting it, and argue from the absurdities that result from so doing, without implicitly presupposing the God of romantic Christianity is omni-everything and atemporal. And to do that is to suppose that he is not the God of romantic Christianity to begin with, but rather a God like the omni-everything, absolute God of classical theism. If the romantic Christian God is omni, atemporal, and a trinity, then that God is omni-everything, and that God is not the God that romantic Christians are talking about, but a straw man and a misdirection and a confusion. You can't have it both ways. If you want to debunk the non-omni God of romantic Christianity, you'll have to dispense with all the talk of omni, ex nihilo, absolute, and atemporal, and talk about the God of romantic Christianity. I bring this up because I want to make Krista acutely aware of something he seems oblivious to. He consistently exempts himself from the considerations he insists upon above, particularly when debunking the concept of God I or Dr. Charlton put forward. And when I say consistently, I mean for more than a decade in Bruce's case. Krista expects me to debunk his concept of God solely on his terms while enjoying the privilege of not having to do the same when he debunks my concept of God. Put another way, if I want to debunk the God of classical theism, I must do it within the parameters of classical theism. Krista, on the other hand, reserves the right to debunk the romantic Christian God within the parameters of, you guessed it, classical theism. I don't know about you, but that seems like having it both ways. It also helps illuminate why our discussions about metaphysics never go anywhere. You can't have it both ways. Krista is right, and I wholeheartedly agree with him. On that note, it would be great to see him apply that criterion to himself more vigorously and rigorously when discussing metaphysics. A few short notes on the matter of debunking conceptualizations of God. Francis Berger. Regarding yesterday's post, I must clarify a few things concerning my scribblings about metaphysics and the nature of God and my discussions with Krista of the orthosphere. I am not motivated to debunk any conceptualization of God, including the God of classical theism. I merely wish to share my views on how I understand God. Those views are, inevitably, often at odds with most classical/traditional/conventional conceptualizations. That does not imply that I regard such conceptualizations with scorn, I simply don't agree with them. I am not all that interested in the God of philosophy/theology. Nor do I regard philosophy/theology as the ultimate path to God. I am more inclined to an intuitive approach because I firmly believe in the development of human consciousness, and the primacy of freedom. I am not out to prove anything or convince anyone of anything when it comes to metaphysics. My assumptions are my own, and I believe that all people must take full personal responsibility for their assumptions without needing to prove the superiority of said assumptions or dismantle the apparent inferiority of other assumptions. Living honestly by one's assumptions as best as one can is enough of a challenge and reward. God and the Metaphysics of a Bird with a Broken Wing. Francis Berger. This is a retelling of a story I came across. God creates a bird with a broken wing out of nothing. God tells the bird that it is his child and that he could not have created it in any other way. God calls this good. He then tells the bird that he can fix the broken wing to some degree if the bird obeys and worships him, but that bird will never really be able to fly. Once again, God calls this good. He concludes by saying, "Look at how powerful I am. Look at how good I am. Look how much I love you. Look at how merciful I am. Look at how well I can fix things." God finds a bird with a broken wing. God sees this is not good. God makes the bird his child by forming it into a place where he and the bird can work together to fix the broken wing so the bird may be able to fly fully. God calls this good. God concludes by saying, "Look at how good I am. Look how much I love you. Look at how merciful I am. Look how well I can help fix things if you want me to and work with me." Note added, the metaphysical comparison above is incomplete, but it at least gets the ball rolling. Completing the comparison requires an explanation of how and why Jesus' contribution to creation is necessary for the bird to be able to fly fully. Relationships with the world of spiritual beings, characterizing stronger and weaker interactions between people and other beings. Bruce Charlton. Since I understand reality ultimately to consist of beings, i.e. beings are the only final and objective categories of reality, and creation to consist of their interactions and relationships, so that the laws, processes, forces, fields etc., naturally, the question of what influences the relationship between beings is of interest. I try to seek such understanding in what we spontaneously know, for example as young children, or at least seek validation of my ideas in this, because I regard our genuinely innate and spontaneous knowledge as ultimately God-given, because a good creator God who loves us would, I think, want to build into us essentially valid, as well as useful, knowledge. On this basis, relationships need to be possible between incarnated people, including those in remote places, and also between us and the dead, and with unincarnated spirits, angels, demons, other kinds of spiritual entity, so we must go beyond the usual materialist ideas of how relationships work. So, on the one hand, it seems that there are no absolute physical limits to the possibility of relationships, which is what would be expected given that all beings are first and foremost of a spiritual nature. Yet at the same time, I notice that the strength of relationships is influenced by a variety of factors. Most obviously spatio-temporal proximity is a factor that increases the likelihood of a relationship and tends to increase its strength. In other words, incarnated beings that are nearby, and are currently alive, are the easiest to make relationships with, and indeed it may be difficult not to have relationships with nearby incarnate beings. Nonetheless, modern city dwellers seem completely to ignore the vast majority of proximate living beings, so the modern mind seems to block relationships as a default, hence our default state of alienation and isolation. Consciousness also has a positive effect on strength of relationships, such that relationships are more likely, and more likely to be strong, when we are aware of another being, than when we are unconscious/unaware. Attention is another positively reinforcing factor on relationships. When we are spiritually orientated towards another being, then we are more likely to relate to them, and more strongly. Attention, in turn, may be a product of motivation, and the factors that affect motivation, interest, impulses etc. Such a consideration of relationships can be helpful in understanding their strength, or weakness. And it can be helpful in understanding the nature and reason for incarnation, for the material instantiation of spiritual beings, such as mortal men, in bodies. An embodied being increases the strength of spatio-temporally close relationships, the relationship between beings here and now, at the cost of weakening relationships between incarnate and discarnate, i.e. spirit, beings. In other words, Our default insensitivity to spirits that are unincarnated, with non-human and non-biological beings, and with people who are distant in time or space, is the flip side of our spontaneous social bias in favor of the human beings around us, now. This gives insight into why few modern people experience spontaneous and strong relationship with spirits. It also explains why consciousness of the reality of spirits in general, and also specific spirits, including dead humans, and directing attention to spirits, can overcome this default insensitivity. Which fits rather neatly with my oft-expressed conviction that our task as modern men includes increased conscious and explicit understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, e.a. metaphysics, as including the spiritual as primary, and also that we must make choices, exercise our agency, take responsibility for the bottom line freedom of our situation in the world. In a nutshell, we need to acknowledge the reality of the spiritual world, and choose to engage with it. But of itself this conscious engagement with the spirit world may be good or evil according to the side with which we affiliate in the spiritual war of this world. So, to be good, all the above should take place in the context of what can briefly be characterized as Christian love. Note, relationships between beings are a primary assumption of this metaphysics, which means that relationships cannot be defined. Relationships can, however, partially be described in terms of attributes, and this is of value in clarifying what is meant by relationships. Just as beings can be described in terms of attributes such as purpose, life, consciousness, self-sustaining ability, possibilities of growth and transformation. These attributes are open-ended in number, and vary very widely in quantity between beings, hence they are not definitive. So relationships can also be described in terms of their attributes. That description of relationships in terms of some of their attributes is what this post is attempting. The darkest hour is just before the dawn. No, it isn't. Bruce Charlton. The darkest hour is just before the dawn may be psychologically true as a proverb, but it is astronomically false. If dawn is defined as the sunrise, the night goes through three evolving phases of increasing light, defined by the sun's angle below the horizon, that are conventionally separated as such. Astronomical dawn, sun is 12 to 18 degrees below the horizon, when the sky lightens from black towards blue such that fainter stars disappear. Nautical dawn, sun is 6 to 12 degrees below the horizon, when, on a clear day, the horizon and brighter stars are still visible at sea. Civil dawn, sun is 0 to 6 degrees below the horizon, when all the stars, except, maybe, Venus, disappear, and it is light enough over land to do normal outdoor stuff. The truth is that it is darkest in the middle of the night, when the sun is at its greatest angle below the horizon. That doesn't fit the moral of the proverb, which is rooted in an archetypal narrative of eucatastrophe. Yet I can't help but suppose that the darkest hour is just before the dawn is a proverbial product of the kind of people who never look at the sky, or who have not been out of bed early enough to observe the dawn for themselves. Go to heaven, go directly to heaven, do not pass through earth, do not collect 200 lashes. Bruce Charlton. One of the questions that are answered inadequately, incoherently, by the off-the-peg mainstream religions is, what is the point of this mortal life on earth? Why don't we go directly to heaven? Why must we mass through mortal life? Why must so many people endure, and, sometimes, enjoy, decades of earthly existence, what may amount to decades of suffering? Even for Christians, why do some of us spend so much time, effort, and, often, misery, tediously mucking about in getting, conceived, born, growing up, living, getting sick, maybe reproducing, getting old and dying, the whole complicated and hazardous rigmarole, before we get to heaven, maybe? There are indeed ways of making sense of this, but mainstream Christianity, with its omni-God and double negative Jesus, is not one of them. But do we really need, after 2000 years without a deep, metaphysical theology that tells us positively what this mortal life is for, and what Jesus did, and how it fits into divine creation? Surely it is, as Jesus seems to have said, enough to love and follow Jesus Christ to salvation. Yes, it is enough for salvation, assuming that we can get through mortal life still wanting it, and not so corrupted as to reject the offer when it is made after our death. Yet this world is full of ex-Christians, fake Christians, self-identified by not really Christians. The churches are collapsing, and those that remain devout are evidently on a path leading down and away from Jesus. But meanwhile, are we really living through mortal life just for that final decision? Or is there something we ought to be doing here and now that will contribute to that eternal resurrected life we anticipate with confidence? Important questions, vital questions, it seems to me. And if our society and our churches are not giving coherent answers, then what are we, personally going to do about it? Say it's not my fault? Or find answers? Or, is there something more important that you need to do instead? A Heroic Age. William Wildeblood. I recall reading once that the Emperor Akbar, the great Mughal ruler of India, who should figure on any top 10 list of monarchs, said that saints cannot be kings nor kings saints. You can see what he meant. The demands of the job are quite different, as are the skill sets required. Donald Trump is clearly no saint, and his opponents attack him on that account regularly, but it seems that even when their arrows hit the target they just fall off. He remains unscathed. Still, he is no saint, but then a real saint would not be able to do the job he appears to have been selected to do, and would not want to either. Their concerns would lie elsewhere. In Hesiod's poem Works and Days there are 5 ages of man which go from gold to silver to bronze to iron, with each age signifying a descent in human happiness, goodness and nobility. The men of the Golden Age are wise, pious and benevolent, while the Silver Age population start off reasonably well but are eventually destroyed for their impiety before the gods. There follow the men of the Bronze Age, but they descend into violence, and their end comes in a great flood. Finally we arrive at the Iron Age, when life is just hard grind. There is no honor among men who lie and feel no shame. It's a sad and sorry time for everyone. The Roman poet Ovid has a similar view of life. He says that the Golden Age was a time of justice, peace and innocence. Humanity was naturally good, but it knew little of the arts and sciences. These came about in the Silver Age as a gift from Jupiter, who took over from Saturn as the principal deity. Once again the Bronze Age is a time of war, though Ovid says men still respected the gods. However, religious feeling is quite lost in the Iron Age, which becomes the most materialistic of times as men dig mines deep into the earth in their search for prosperity, that being all they care about. Truth and decency are distinguished only by their absence. You will note I said Hesiod has 5 ages, but I only mentioned 4. Ovid only has the conventional 4, but between the Bronze and Iron Ages Hesiod inserts another, which is the Heroic Age. The Bronze Age ends in war and destruction, and the Iron Age is a time of universal decline, but the Heroic Age represents a kind of restoration of past glory. It doesn't last, but it is there all the same. A time of heroes who are certainly flawed but still are heroes, and they bring about an age when the downward trajectory is held back for a period. The theory of cycles allows for the recapitulation of the major cycle within each section of a minor cycle. There are even further recapitulations of the pattern within these sub-cycles. We are undoubtedly in the Iron Age and have been for a while. But perhaps the elements of the major cycle are repeated on many levels, and perhaps, if Hesiod is right, we are due another heroic age or mini-version thereof. It won't last, but that doesn't matter because these ages only relate to the material world and our true home and destiny are elsewhere. But, in terms of the material world, perhaps we are going to experience a small restoration or, at least, a temporary arresting of the slide downwards. Is BRICS the backlash of lawful evil? Bruce Charlton. As the West continues its path of, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, chaotic evil, or what I would term spite-driven sorothic self and other destruction, it seems to me that lawful evil, i.e. the harmonic, control-motivated, hence totalitarian and bureaucratic type of evil, is making an attempt at comeback via the now world-dominant BRICS grouping. In other words, the system, the matrix, is doomed to inwardly driven, and actively desired, self-destruction, and is already collapsing, in the West. Therefore the powers of evil whose strategy is to impose a material mechanism for spiritual damnation, are shifting attention from the West to the rest. Geopolitics is always evil, no matter its explicit purpose. While, from the POV of the dominant countries of the Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom, BRICS seems to be a means towards the end of national sovereignty and the cultural autonomy in face of a monolithic globalism, the very facts and necessities of any multinational compromise coalition, continue to push the existing and emerging alliance towards the nature of lawful evil. This is evidenced by several of the many recent statements of BRICS policy and strategy, which favor UN-type organizations to formulate and enforce international regulation. It therefore seems like the demons of lawful evil have abandoned the West to the ministrations of chaotic evil, and are increasingly directing their main efforts towards the rest. From a Christian perspective, we are dealing with greater versus lesser evils, at best. Therefore there is again the pitfall opening of inducing people actively to support that which is actually evil, on the basis that it is a different, and maybe less extreme, kind of evil than that which preceded it. The danger is that Christians are actively supporting lawful evil on the basis that it is possible to be optimistic about its prospects in this world, here and now. I suggest that Christians need to be much clearer than they currently seem to be, about the necessity actively to support only that which is good by motivation and methods, no matter how weak that good may be in this worldly terms, and no matter how pessimistic the prospects of good seem, with things as they currently are. On the material and earthly level, Christians will inevitably lose, sooner or later, and it is on the spiritual level that are their solid grounds for realistic optimism. The grounds of our hope are sure, but not of this world. Once we have grasped this, then, but only then, can we see and know how such a spiritual and next worldly expectation can and will improve things in this mortal life. In D&D terms we should eschew not just evil, but the categories of lawful and chaotic, and pursue that which is creative. The philosophy of God draws one closer to philosophy, not God. Francis Berger. The philosophy of God, classical theism, is proudly grounded in logic. Logic is respected if it is valid. Most of the arguments for God posited by classical theism are logically valid. But here's the thing, a logically valid argument need not be true. An argument is considered valid even when its premises or conclusion is false. Hence, many arguments comprising the philosophy of God are logically valid. However, such logical validity is not a confirmation of soundness or truth. Logical arguments must be valid and sound to be true. That is, sound arguments must contain true premises and a true conclusion. And that is indicative of a big problem with the philosophy of God, especially when it comes to metaphysical assumptions. What masquerades as truth in the philosophy of God is often little more than logical validity. If anything, logical validity demonstrates the limits of touting logic and evidence as the best and only valid sources of truth. Yet those who adhere to and insist upon the validity of the philosophy of God as the ultimate mode through which God can be understood and proved are quick to reject and dismiss the soundness of intuitive direct knowing as sound, that is, valid and true. My lived experience tells me otherwise. The philosophy of God draws one closer to philosophy, and the logically valid God of philosophy. Intuition draws one closer to God. Note added, the above is an intentionally gross oversimplification of the implications of logical validity versus logical soundness. I do not mean to imply that logical validity has no place in reasoning or cannot be employed as a useful tool in thinking, or that reasoning completely devoid of logical validity is completely possible or desirable, only that it should not be regarded as truth, per se, particularly when applied to metaphysical assumptions. In this sense, I reject the usefulness of logical validity to a great degree. I also wish to draw attention to the primacy of intuition over logic. I am not suggesting that intuition is infallible, rather, that it should be the starting point of thinking. But that is best left for a future post. Another problem with logic-heavy paths to God is that they expose faith to logic-heavy paths away from God. I don't think classic theists fully acknowledge how much damage logical validity wielded by atheists and anti-God types has inflicted on Christianity on the whole. Lastly, logic has a tendency to place the head before the heart, which can lead to all sorts of problems in the long term, religiously speaking. Even William Lane Craig acknowledges the primacy of intuition over philosophy. Francis Berger. Readers of this blog are likely aware of the ongoing discussion involving Krista of the Orthosphere, Dr. Charlton, and me, a discussion Krista initiated via comments on a post I wrote about the nature of uncreated freedom. Krista continuously accuses Dr. Charlton and me of refusing to answer his questions, particularly about arguments like the principle of sufficient reason and the Kalam cosmological argument. Referring to arguments like the principle of sufficient reason or the cosmological argument amounts to little more than an implicit admission on Krista's part. The nature of the admission. He doesn't give the arguments and answers Dr. Charlton, and I provide the attention and consideration they deserve. If he did, he would not have to refer to things like the principle of sufficient reason or the cosmological argument, because he could easily infer what our answers mean and how they fit in the context of those things. Anyway, in the interest of clarity, I will dedicate a few posts to addressing the principle of sufficient reason and the cosmological argument from my perspective and assumptions, starting with the cosmological argument. Today's post will be brief. So, Romantic Christianity argues for the primacy of intuition over external considerations like philosophical arguments. Put another way, Romantic Christianity posits that everyone's beliefs are grounded in intuition, regardless of whether an individual accepts that as true. William Lane Craig, the philosopher behind the contemporary cosmological argument, confirms this Romantic Christian principle.
I am convinced that the cosmological argument, is a good argument. I just don't regard the argument as the basis for my belief in God. I've been quite candid about that. My belief in God is a properly basic belief grounded in the inner witness of God's Holy Spirit.
Putting the argument aside for the moment, I wholeheartedly agree with Craig. In fact, I'll take it a step further. I don't regard any argument as the basis for my belief in God. Like Craig, my belief in God is a properly basic belief grounded in the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, not God's Holy Spirit, but more on that in another post. My personal relationship with the Holy Spirit trumps external considerations, including philosophical arguments. If I were of a flippant nature, I could simply tell Krista that the cosmological argument has absolutely no bearing whatsoever on my belief in God, leave it there, and feel perfectly justified in doing so. But I won't do that. Conversely, Craig goes on to say that this basic belief in God has no impact on the soundness of the cosmological argument.
Similarly, whatever reason I have personally for believing in God, whether it's the witness of the Holy Spirit or the ontological argument or the teleological argument or divine revelation, or whatever, that just has no relation to the soundness or the worth of the cosmological argument.
The statement above helps shed light on why Krista is urging me to engage with the cosmological argument. Like Craig, he believes it is a sound argument that supports the classical theist omniconceptualization of God, thereby undermining my non-omniconceptualization of God. Once again, based on the primacy of intuitive belief, I am within my rights to tell Krista to stuff it. He is well within his rights to do the same, but this nullifies any chance at discussion or sharing ideas. In light of this, I will begin at addressing aspects of the cosmological argument in my next post. My kingdom is not of this world. On being led by the fourth gospel, called John. Bruce Charlton. A couple of days ago I wrote that we should think of Jesus primarily as the Good Shepherd, leading those who will follow to resurrected life everlasting beyond biological death, and not as a king. Such is a natural consequence of the decision I made to base my Christian belief on the fourth gospel, called John, the background to which decision is covered in my mini-book from a few years ago, Lazarus Writes. I am aware that history took a very different path of putting the synoptic gospels, and indeed the epistles of Paul, above the fourth gospel, and also of interpreting the fourth gospel in light of the rest of the New Testament. However, I regard this as an error, simply because I believe what the fourth gospel says about itself, and therefore put it first and above all other scriptures. The fourth gospel tells us, repeatedly and in many ways, that Jesus is not a king, that it is a mistake to regard him as such. How then do I interpret the phrase "my kingdom is not of this world"? See this verse in context below the post. Quite simple, in the context of the whole gospel and of the section in which this occurs, I understand Jesus to be saying to Pilate something like, "My kingdom is not of this world." In other words, Jesus is telling Pilate something like, "I am not saying that I am a king, that is your assertion, and that of Jews who have misunderstood my mission and role. Furthermore, what you might think of as the kingdom to which I belong is not even part of this mortal life on earth. I am, in other words, not primarily concerned with this mortal world. What I have to teach and do is concerned with life beyond death, the world of eternity, heaven not earth. In other words, it is a radical misunderstanding to suppose that the fourth gospel asserts Jesus is a king. Of course, most Christians through history regard Jesus as a king because this is clearly and repeatedly stated in other parts of the New Testament. Jesus, after death and ascension, is often regarded as true ruler of this world, Pantocrator. But if the fourth gospel is what it says it is, then this must be an error, no matter how common. I completely understand that Christians who take the orthodox and traditional, church-led, view of Christianity, will reject this idea outright as being ridiculous. They have made very different assumptions concerning the relative validity and authority of scriptures, and of the authority of their church, or of historical churches. I understand this perspective, and why people do not want to go against the weight of tradition and church authority, but I reject it for myself, because I believe the fourth gospel and therefore think it is a mistake. Here and now, however differently it may have been in the past, I believe that understanding Christ as King of this world, first and foremost, may well lead to contradiction and adverse consequences. Instead of a king, we need to grasp that Jesus is essentially the Good Shepherd, one who enables all who will follow him to attain resurrection into heaven.
John 18:33-38. Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again, and called Jesus, and said unto him, Art thou the King of the Jews? Jesus answered him, Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from hence. Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice. Pilate saith unto him, What is truth?
The positive path forward through life. Bruce Charlton. If oneness is primary, why did oneness allow that oneness be fractured, only to permit or demand the restoration of primal oneness? Contra oneness, life is linear and the future is open. Therefore, what we need above all is a way forward, and the inner motivation to pursue it. Most important in faith is that there is always, at every moment, a positive path ahead. This must be so, or else we would, by now, be dead. Avoiding wrong paths, double negative living, does not suffice, since wrong paths are limitless in number, and all living would be expended on error and repentance. Our path forward is for each of us to find, because it is not, and cannot be, externally provided from any source in this world. It must be sought, which is our responsibility, and be discerned, by ourselves, as much as is possible. There can be, and may be, divine rescue and the external imposition of a direction when our own efforts fail, but remember that this is seriously second best. God most wants us to do it, so that we will learn it. Divine rescue may be useless or counterproductive in terms of what we are here for, promoting passivity instead of creativity. What is the bottom line? Not one thing, because we are beings, and beings are complex, irreducible, by nature. The true complexity of this world derives primarily from the hearts of beings, secondly from the relationships of beings. In other words, the complexity of this world is rooted in extreme structural simplicity, therefore not in complex theological philosophical schemata. Unconditional, universal love is a benign disposition towards abstract thought forms, whereas Christian love is for particular and personal beings. Personal and abstract are distinguishable, and vitally so, but are not completely separable. Thought forms become inhabited by personal spirit beings, thus unconditional and abstract love gets personalized, willy-nilly, while personal love contains the expansile tendency to seek more of itself, pressing towards other and, as yet, unknown persons. Jesus overcame the world, but nobody else among men has come near. Including not the saints, by their own accounts. Neither you nor I can overcome the world. It is a terrible, and terribly common, error to suppose that men can overcome the world, or, even worse, that we should. That was not / is not how the world is set up in God's creation. It is not how things work. There is no such thing as enlightenment, we cannot overcome the world, but there is repentance, which, properly understood, is the path to eternal resurrected life. Men are God intended to know, acknowledge and repent sin, to learn from mortal life, that we may thereby become better men in eternal resurrected life. We should not strive to overcome this world, because Christ's kingdom is not of this world. Instead we should know and follow Jesus, out of this world and into heaven.
John 16:33. These things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world.
The Kalam argument, God is timeless, of course, but also temporal. Sort of. Kind of. Francis Berger. Behold the first two premises and conclusion of William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument.
Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
And the further premise and conclusion Craig appended later.
If the universe has a cause, then an uncaused, personal creator of the universe exists who sans, without, the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless and enormously powerful. Therefore, an uncaused, personal creator of the universe exists, who sans the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless and enormously powerful.
I'll wade into my own thoughts about this argument in the coming days. For now, I'd just like to focus on one point in 4 and 5 of the argument, specifically, the bit about the uncaused, personal creator of the universe who is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless and enormously powerful sans the universe. Now, at first glance, I would interpret this as God having all those qualities despite the universe, meaning the creation of the universe had no effect on him as beginningless, changeless, etc. But then I considered that Craig may be referring to time. Is he suggesting that God may be temporal? Maybe. Kinda? Sort of. Here's what Craig has to say on the subject.
Because the biblical data are underdeterminative, Christian theists have defended a wide variety of views on God's relationship to time and change. Some have defended views according to which God is timeless and immutable, others views according to which God is omnitemporal and constantly changing. My own view is something of a hybrid.
God is timeless sans creation and temporal since the first moment of creation. Wait. Did he say God may be temporal rather than strictly atemporal? Well, kind of. Sort of. Not really. Craig explains his position via an inviting wall of text here. Why do Christians have such difficulty accepting time as an inherent reality within beings? Same reason they insist upon things like the Kalam cosmological argument as proof of creation out of nothing. Christianity is ultimately not about happiness, nor the elimination of suffering. Bruce Charlton. What is life for? It to be happy, which implies a continual timeless state of bliss. If happiness is rooted in the elimination of all suffering, which is the emphasis in some major religions, then there can be no needs, no desire, no wanting. All just is, and what is good. Or else is life rooted in purpose? Purpose is dynamic, includes time, and purpose entails and some degree of dissatisfaction, yearning, wanting, desiring. Because if here and now was wholly satisfactory and sufficient, then there would be no reason to change it, no purpose. Happiness, and the elimination of suffering, is in ultimate conflict with a life of purpose. One or other, but not both, can be the aim of spiritual life. They can't simultaneously be the aim. If we try to conflate both in a unity, then one or other will, in actuality, be dominant over the other. So purpose is in conflict with the desire for a state of perfect happiness, and with the desire to eliminate all suffering, because purpose entails some degree of suffering. To live, always with purpose, is always to experience some degree of dissatisfaction with here and now, in order to desire some, somewhat different future state. Therefore the desire for happiness, including the elimination of suffering, is incompatible with purpose. This is part of the incompatibility of, on the one hand, the many forms of oneness spirituality, of Eastern religion so styled, yet actually far more widespread than the East, including being strongly, and from early, within Christianity, with, on the other hand, Christianity, properly understood. Christianity is about purpose, ultimately. Therefore, not ultimately about happiness, nor about the elimination of suffering. What Christianity is about, is dynamic, purposive, taking place in and through time. It is about love as the basis of creation. But because love has so often been defined in terms of a static state of perfect happiness, the dynamic purposive nature of love, hence of creation, has become confused and or occluded. To put it the other way about, there are two distinct ways of considering love as the goal of existence. One is as a timeless, perfect in itself, blissful, and essentially impersonal state. The other is as dynamic, purposive, creative, and essentially interpersonal. Note added, it could be said that love, understood as participation in divine creation, is itself the ultimate happiness, and in a sense that would be correct, for those who choose to follow Jesus Christ. But it is not the ultimate happiness for everybody. It seems that for many people the highest happiness entails a changeless bliss. And there are others for whom the greatest gratification, if not exactly happiness, entails that which Christians regard as evil, selfish gratifications of various kinds. Strictly speaking, Christa's God of classical theism fails the Kalam cosmological argument. Francis Berger.
In our discussions, I've shown why the perpetuity that you and Bruce advocate is problematic, not because it disagrees with classical theism, but because it fails the test of the principle of sufficient reason. I have not mentioned that it fails also the test of the Kalam cosmological argument, though it does. You have not addressed those arguments. You have not even noticed them. To be honest, it begins to look as though you are the one who is so committed to his own notions that he can't bring himself to confront the problems inherent in them.
That is how Christa of the Orthosphere has summarized the state of our discussions on freedom, the nature of God, time, etc. Perpetuity is the name Christa has ascribed to the position that Bruce and I posit concerning the nature of time. It is his term, not ours. Anyway, the reason Bruce and I have not addressed the tests Christa suggests is simple: they are irrelevant to our assumptions. Bruce explains, as an argument it gets nowhere with me, because I reject the assumptions behind the first premise. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, which assumes that there are things that begin to exist, rather than having always existed, and I infer that he assumes that these things include human beings. Ditto for me. To be honest, I don't understand Christa's insistence that we address things like the Kalam cosmological argument or the principle of sufficient reason. I believe in the reality of uncreated freedom, which entails that God is not the only uncaused cause at the most fundamental level of existence. Thus, the cosmological argument and the principle of sufficient reason have no real bearing on my assumptions. However, they have a tremendous bearing on Christa's assumptions. In fact, it is fair to say that they represent the very basis of Christa's classical theist assumptions and beliefs. From all of this, I can conclude that Christa regards my assumptions as incoherent. He is motivated to prove this supposed incoherence to me via arguments supporting his own classical theist assumptions, beliefs, views, and position, which he regards as ironclad and true. I touched briefly on the cosmological argument yesterday and will continue exploring it in future posts to address Christa's concerns. I infer that Christa is throwing the Kalam cosmological argument at me because he believes it debunks my assumptions while simultaneously supporting his classical theist position on the nature of God, the origin of creation, and time. What is Christa's position? Here's the man in his own words responding to my unthinkable thought crime of considering God's existence before creation.
Francis is struggling with that paragraph because he misconstrues eternity. Sub specie aeternitatis, there is no time before God created, and there is no time after God created. Eternity is a now of infinite duration. All times are present to the Eternal One, all at once. He sees all times, but not the way we do. That's why he tells us, in Exodus 3:14 and John 8:56-58, that he is I am. Every event occurs for him in the present tense. Excursus, when God tells us in Exodus 3:14 that he is I am that I am, he is saying that he is necessary, that there is no cause or reason of him, other than himself, that his being is the reason of his being. And b. What is necessary is ipso facto eternal. Ergo, etc. Thus for him, his act of being himself and his act of creating in all the moments and creaturely acts in all the worlds he creates are happening now, as aspects of a single act, a single moment, of infinite scope along all dimensions. For him, fiat lux and the eschaton are right now, so is every moment of the everlasting lives of the blessed in heaven. There is for him then no such thing as before he created, no such thing as a time when any creature has not yet been brought to its proper complete fulfillment.
Here is another description of Krista's position from a secondary source.
The claim that God is timeless is a denial of the claim that God is temporal. First, God exists, but does not exist at any temporal location. Rather than holding that God is everlastingly eternal, and, therefore, he exists at each time, this position is that God exists but he does not exist at any time at all. God is beyond time altogether. It could be said that although God does not exist at any time, God exists at eternity. That is, eternity can be seen as a non-temporal location as any point within time is a temporal location. Second, it is thought that God does not experience temporal succession. God's relation to each event in a temporal sequence is the same as his relation to any other event. God does not experience the first century before he experiences the 21st. Both of these centuries are experienced by God in one timeless now. So, while it is true that in the 13th century Aquinas prayed for understanding and received it, God's response to his prayers is not something that also occurred in that century. God, in his timeless state of being, heard Aquinas' prayers and answered them. He did not first hear them and then answer them. He heard and answered in one timeless moment. In fact, he did so in the same timeless moment that he hears and answers prayers offered in the 21st century.
I mentioned that the idea of an atemporal God becomes incoherent if one assumes the reality of time, to which Krista responded.
It's the other way round. If God is not atemporal, time becomes an incoherent notion that cannot be realized concretely.
Okay, now that we have established Krista's position, let's revisit William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument.
Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. If the universe has a cause, then an uncaused, personal creator of the universe exists who sans. Without, the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless and enormously powerful. Therefore, an uncaused, personal creator of the universe exists, who sans the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless and enormously powerful.
The first two premises and conclusion are William Lane Craig's original formulation of the argument, to which he appends the further premise and conclusion. The first two premises and conclusion affirm Krista's classical theist position, but the appended premise and conclusion do not. Why? Because they do not affirm Krista's position that God is atemporal. Craig supports Krista's assumption about there being no before or after in the life of God, a point Krista vehemently stressed in his discussions with me.
You can't talk about before and after in the life of the eternal God of classical theism, and argue from the absurdities that result from so doing, without implicitly presupposing that the eternal God of classical theism is temporal. And to do that is to suppose that he is not the God of classical theism to begin with, but rather a God like Thor. If there is before and after in the life of God, so that he could enjoy his perfection before he created, thus raising the question of why he created a world utterly superfluous to his perfect enjoyment, then he is temporal, and he is not the God that the classical theists are talking about, but a straw man and a misdirection and a confusion. You can't have it both ways.
Now, Craig's views align with Krista as far as before and after the life of God as far as the beginning of the universe and time is concerned. However, unlike Krista, Craig does not conclude that the God of the Kalam cosmological argument is strictly atemporal.
Because the biblical data are underdeterminative, Christian theists have defended a wide variety of views on God's relationship to time and change. Some have defended views according to which God is timeless and immutable, others views according to which God is omnitemporal and constantly changing. My own view is something of a hybrid. God is timeless sans creation and temporal since the first moment of creation.
What does that mean? Honestly, who the hell knows? In any case, two things have happened here. First, The author of the Kalam cosmological argument affirms that biblical data are underdeterminative, drawing into question the biblical proof Krista supplies above. He also admits that there are a variety of views out there, undermining Krista's stance that the classical theist view is the only correct one. Second, timeless sans creation and temporal since the first moment of creation is not the strictly atemporal God that Krista touts as the only conceivable God. Krista has insisted that if God is not atemporal, time becomes an incoherent notion that cannot be realized concretely. I guess that means he rejects Craig's position that God is temporal since creation. He must, because the claim that God is timeless is a denial of the claim that God is temporal. It's all the same to me because, as I mentioned above, I regard the premises and conclusions of the Kalam cosmological argument as irrelevant to my assumptions. I don't think the same could be said of Krista. So, here's my problem. Why does Krista tout a cosmological argument that supports his position on some points, yet whose ultimate conclusion diverges on the matter of the necessity of God as atemporal? I shared this link with Krista during one of our discussions to demonstrate that not all philosophers working within orthodox parameters regard the classical theist position on time as the do-all and end-all of the matter. Craig's ideas about a temporal God were included in that link. Krista's response. He lumps Craig together with other modern philosophers who have turned away from God and toward the world as their fundamental point of orientation. Okay, if that truly is the case, then why badger me with Craig's Kalam cosmological argument? Moreover, why does Krista promote a cosmological argument from a man he accuses of having turned away from God? That aside, strictly speaking, it would seem that Krista's conceptualization of God fails the Kamal cosmological argument, at least as far as the appended premise and conclusion are concerned. Craig's cosmological argument argues for the reality of a God who is timeless sans creation and temporal since the first moment of creation. That is not what Krista argues for. I guess that means he would regard Craig's conceptualization of God as a confusion, misdirection, and straw man. Still, that doesn't save his conceptualization of God from failing Craig's Kalam cosmological argument, strictly speaking. So what gives? I fully expect Krista will respond in his usual wall of text form, defining this, qualifying that, refuting everything else, citing the Bible, all while referring to Aquinas, Anselm, Aristotle, Boethius, etc. Anyway, I'll have more thoughts on the Kalam cosmological argument in my next post. End note, I find all of this to be a miserable business. Philosophy. Logic. Ultimately, word games that, in the end, prove nothing besides the penchant to draw closer to philosophy than to God.